Welcome, everybody. My name is Charisse. I am here at the central branch of the Howard County Library System. And we are so excited to have two excellent presenters tonight, Agostina Scito and Dr. Sarah Vaya. We are very grateful for partnering with the Climate Reality Project. And this is the third in our monthly series of climate change discussions. Tonight's focus will be on how Howard County residents feel about what is going on with the climate. And the discussion will be a shared discussion. And so we will keep everyone muted with their video off during the presentation. And you can post any questions you have in the chat. And after each of the speakers does their presentation, you will be able to unmute yourself and ask your own questions. But please be aware, we are recording this session. So if you don't want to be on the recording, which will be on the library's YouTube channel, please just use the chat for your questions. As you've probably realized, we do have real-time captions for this class. These are captions generated automatically by Zoom, so they may have errors in them. By hovering at the bottom of your screen, you will see the CC button, and you can toggle that on and off to turn on and off the captions. I am going to just pitch for next month already. These are excellent discussions, and I will put in the chat that our next session will be December 14th at 7 p.m. and I will put the link to our registration. Many of you may also be aware that we have a fantastic exhibit now at the Central Branch called Undesign the Red Line about housing discrimination and how that has tied into the history of structural racism in the United States. I will put the link to information about the Red Line exhibit in our chat as well. I also encourage your feedback. So we will put a survey in the chat, and we are very eager to hear what topics you would like to talk about, because I know Mr. Scito and Dr. Vaya are very interested in educating us on the things that we in the community want to know. And I really appreciate their willingness to interact with us and present all this valuable information to us. So I'm going to turn this over to Agostina Scito from the Climate Reality Project, and we're going to talk about climate change.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Charisse, and thank you to all of you for spending some of your evening here with us for this discussion about climate change. And we do want to hear from you, so please put your questions in the chat, but there'll be a time during the presentations where you can ask questions live if you want to. This is our agenda for today. In the news and clues section, we'll talk about COP26. Maybe you've heard about it, maybe you didn't. So there'll be some good information about what happened. This is a very important meeting that took place in Glasgow just recently. And then Dr. Sarah Vaya will present a survey of what do people in Maryland and our county think about climate change, which I hope will spark some good discussions and conversations. And for the action and choice corner this month, we're going to talk about your carbon footprint, how you can calculate it, review it, and then I think that will be useful also for discussions about actions that you can take to reduce the carbon footprint, as you'll see. So let's start with the usual introduction. We're going to go pretty quickly through this. So maybe Sarah, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Sarah Vaya. Thanks for coming. We really appreciate you being here. I'm a professor at University of Maryland in College Park, and also what they call a climate extension specialist, which means I spend my time teaching people about climate change. And I've done a lot of work with the Maryland Master Gardeners and Master Naturalists on this topic, but also with a wide array of other people. I recently published a big report about carbon sequestration in agricultural soil, which is a big topic right now too. That's part of President Biden's plan. And you can, I think you can see my my pointer. You can go to my website if you would like to know more about carbon footprint, because I gave a whole webinar on that last year, and I gave a number of other webinars too, so you might find something there of interest. Okay, back to you.
Okay, thank you. And in my case, not as accomplished, but I am a volunteer with the Climate Reality Project. We'll talk about that in a little minute. Originally from Italy, I have lived here in Ellicott City now since 2005. I joined the Climate Reality Project in 2019 with my wife, Pam. We trained to become climate reality leader in August of 2019, and we have delivered a couple of presentations in collaborations with the Howard County Library in the past already. What is the Climate Reality Project? This is an organization that was founded in 2006 by former US Vice President Al Gore, with the mission to empower everyday people, basically like us, to become involved in the climate crisis conversation and share the truth about its impact and the available solutions, calling everyone to join into the action and drive change all over our planet. This is a global organization with a lot of leaders all over the country. So let's go to now our subject for news and clues. As I said, we're going to talk about COP26. So what is it? This is the biggest annual international climate reality conference that is organized by the United Nations and has about 197 signatories. What does that mean? There are a lot of groups and people. There are over 2,000, I think, participants on this specific conference. But there are 196 countries and the UN that at the end of the conference will sign an agreement, which becomes, the collection of all the discussions and also the pledges that the countries have done to overcome the problems with the climate change. So today's, this year, Conference of the Parties, that's what COP stands for, took place in Glasgow, just finished recently on November 13th. And this was the declaration of the goals that the conference had set up for themselves, right? Well, at the beginning of the conference. The first one was to secure global net zero by mid-century and keep 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is about 2.7 Fahrenheit within reach. And we'll see how important that is in our discussion later. This is, I'm reading from their poster here. The countries are being asked to come forward with an ambitious 2030 emission reduction target that align with reaching the net zero by the middle of the century. To deliver on these stretching targets, countries will need to accelerate the phase out of coal, encourage investment in renewables, curtail deforestation, and speed up the switch to electric vehicles. So this is the goal that was set before the conference. The other goal, which I think was very important addition to the discussion here, was about adapting. And the goal was to adapt to protect communities and natural habitats. And here is the declaration. The climate is already changing and it will continue to change even as we reduce emissions with devastating effects. At COP26, we need to work together to enable and encourage countries affected by climate change to protect and restore ecosystems, build defenses, put warning systems in place, and make infrastructure and agriculture more resilient to avoid loss of homes, livelihoods, and lives. So you can see how these are very ambitious goals. The next two, maybe a little bit more simpler, mobilize finance is a project to help support the poorest countries. As we will discuss actually next month when we'll talk about climate justice, it's actually happens, right? That less wealthy countries will bear a lot of the consequences of climate change without having the resources to help, their population. So this was an important goal, and there was a fund established, and we'll see how that happens to that. The declaration here says that to realize our first two goals, developed countries must deliver on their promise to raise at least $100 billion in climate finance per year. And so that is supposed to be the amount of funds available to the poorest country. And then the last goal is to work together to deliver. And this is as important as any other, right? Because it's good to make promises, but the delivery of those promises is what will bring the results. Just to give you a clue here, the last sentence on the slide, John Kerry said that this would be the last best hope for the world to get its act together, right? So we have been discussing this for a while. And in fact, I want to show you in my next slide a little bit about the history of how we got to COP26. 26 is the 26th time the conference of the party took place, one each year except for 2020. This started in 1995. COP1 in Berlin in 1995 was the first conference, which followed the Hurt Summit organized by the UN in 1992. But then I have highlighted here some of the most significant of these meetings, right? 1997 was in Kyoto, COP3, and led to the Kyoto Protocol. That was the first large agreement involving 192 parties that agreed to reduce emissions. So this was a recognition that action was needed in 1997 already, right? But then it took some time to formalize that recognition into action. COP13, Bali in 2007, extended the Kyoto Protocol to all countries, not just the industrialized countries, right? Recognizing this is a global phenomenon that we all have to work towards. And then 2009, COP15 in Copenhagen, where the parties agreed to keep the global temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius, about 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And in addition, the richer nation pledged to finance the transition in developed countries. So this is why, what I was saying before is so important, right? We had established already some of these goals, right, in 2009. But then what happens, right? So, we go from COP15 to COP21, Paris 2015, which concluded with the so-called Paris Agreements. And all parties agreed to aim to limit the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, about 2.7 Fahrenheit. So you see how a lot of discussions and a lot of meetings, and we are still where we were, quite a few years ago. Here is what COP26 actually was able to reach, and this is a very small list of achievements. I don't mean to say that this is the only thing that were discussed or agreed. The document is actually a pretty large and extensive document. There are a lot of details, but these are the ones that are most significant. Everybody agrees, all countries, all parties agrees that action is urgent and the time it's running out. We need to do something quickly. However, right, the problem is that even the pledges that were made in 2015 as part of the Paris Agreement have not been realized yet, right? And so countries are not keeping up with their pledges and their promises. And in this conference, they still have not created plans, specific plans, not all countries at least. And so they agreed that they will meet next year to pledge further cuts to emissions of carbon dioxide. And then they agreed to plan the phase down rather than the phase out of coal, and significantly increase money to help poor countries cope with the effect of climate change and make the switch to clean energy. So to me, right, we are restating basically what we had been saying for quite a while. Some of the other more important and concrete agreements also, these are called international agreements because not all countries signed for those. But for example, US and China, right, the two largest contributor to the emission of carbon dioxide in the air, announced a joint agreement to do more to cut emission by this decade, which is important. But again, there are not a lot of details. But these declarations are important. They have to be they're part of the process, right, to get to the solution. Leaders of more than 100 countries, including Brazil, China, Russia, and the United States, promised to end deforestation by 2030. This is, as you know, we discussed the importance of trees and forests and their contribution, right, to make sure that carbon is absorbed and so reduce the global warming effect. So ending deforestation by 2030 would be a great goal if we achieve that. Also methane, right? Methane is this gas. We discussed this very briefly before, but certainly contributes to global warming in ways that are even larger than carbon dioxide, but different also. And methane seems to be one of these fossil fuel that is difficult to get rid of. While we all recognize that coal is kind of at the end of its life and oil is going down, methane is actually pretty large and very heavily used. But methane emissions, would need to be reduced or eliminated completely. And so these agreement to end at least 30% by the end of this decade was a good results. And then finally, the last item here, India. India is a very large country, as we all know, and also contributor, to emission as a growing population, but also growing production is going on. And India is struggling with meeting some of the required cut to the emission of CO2. And so in this case, they joined the rest of the nations pledging to reach net zero, but not until a 2070 deadline. So you see how a lot of things happened, a lot of good things happened, but we need more concrete plans to achieve our goals. So some questions still remain open, right? So for example, right? So how do we reach those cuts? Which countries are going to do their part? By when, how much? So these are details on the implementations that have been postponed to the next meeting in a year from now. So it's important that we keep everybody's through to what they're saying. And then, again, we talked about the financing of wealthiest nation that should help the poorer countries. Also, this is not been defined in details, but it is important and needs to be done. So what are the reactions to COP26, right? Not everybody has been happy about this negotiation. In some cases, negotiators from countries around the world suggested that they were accepting these agreement in the spirit of compromise, but telling us that this is not enough to reach our goal of the 1.5 degrees Celsius. And in fact, we'll see what that means in a little bit. The activists were really disappointed by COP26. And in fact, in some cases, they would just say that the entire conference, the parties have not delivered on their promises. So it's been a lot of talks, but not much action. One interesting point here I put in these slides is that the minister of the Maldives, right, and this was interesting to me because while we all understand the impact of climate change, we don't always experience the effect directly in a significant way. Not everybody, at least. But here is a situations where some of these islands, Pacific islands, they actually are seeing the sea rise level encroaching into their coastal areas and interfering with their lives and their livelihood. Here, the minister says the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees is a death sentence for these islands. And it's not just the Maldives, it's a group of Pacific Islands, low-lying ground that will be covered if the global warming continues to go on by the 2100 timeframe. So conclusion, no one loves the proposed COP26 deal, but most nations say they will accept it. So it's a promise to move forward, to continue to work. Is a recognition that not enough has been done, and we have to continue on the action. And we, the individuals, right? We have the responsibility to make sure that our governments, our countries are paying attention, right, to these subject and continue to make progress towards those actions. On the bright side, like I said earlier, in the some of the nations and some of the activists felt that there is a lot of talk and no enough action. However, we all have to recognize that global warming and climate change also, right, need a vast international agreement and cooperation among most, if not all countries, but at least all the most significant ones, right? And before the Paris Agreement, the expected trajectory for the global temperature increase was about 3.6 to 4.2 degrees Celsius by 2100. But after the Paris Agreement, some action was actually taking place. And in fact, based on our current situation, which includes, the use of wind and solar energy, which we have discussed last month, actually as a success story of our actions taking place, our pathway is for an increase of about 2.7 to 3.1 degrees Celsius by 2100. With the current pledges and what we heard from COP26 about further cutting of emissions that are projected by 2030, if the nations follow through on these promises, the warming is expected to reach 2 to 2.4 degrees Celsius by 2100. So we're not there at the 1.5 that was the goal of the Paris Agreement and all the discussion since, but we're making progress. So it seems that these meetings, while not as fast as we would like them to be in the actions following the agreements, are at least making a little bit of progress into our situation. So, and I think this is my last presentation on COP26. Sarah, do you have anything that you wanted to add to what we presented?
Well, maybe just the comment that although all of the 196 countries or 197 countries have to agree, the fact of the matter is that most of the emissions have been caused by people in the developed world, and the underdeveloped countries are the ones that are suffering for this now. They have not caused this. People in the Maldives, their per capita emissions aren't even close to what the emissions per capita per person are in the US. So the US has a huge responsibility because we not only have the highest per capita rate of carbon emissions, but also our country has contributed the most cumulative emissions over time. So even though a lot of folks say, oh, well, why do we need to do anything until China and India step up? Well, because we are one of the major causes of the problem. And I think what we witnessed in this, in COP26, which, by the way, the 26 means that nations have been talking about this problem for 26 years now, and we have not really made a suitable amount of action. And while pledges are important, pledges are talk and not action. And so it's very important that we as people within the US keep the pressure up on our government to make sure that we have legislation and action that follows the pledges and the promises, because if we don't do the action, then we won't reach even 2.4 degrees C. So there's a lot more that could be said about that, but we really don't have time to go into it. So I'm going to move on to the next topic.
Sounds good. I
yeah.
wanted to ask if there are questions from the audience, and then we'll move quickly to the next part of this presentation. But if there are any questions, please come forward.
Yeah, please put any questions in the chat. I don't see any right now.
Well, if you think of any, we can address them at the end. But again, we want to respect your time and keep this within an hour. So let's just sort of move forward. We're sort of reversing the time amount that we've allotted for these sections. The presentation usually gets the most time, but I just want to very briefly during this presentation give you an idea of what people in Maryland and Howard County think about climate change, because it can be hard to know what other people think, particularly because climate change has been really co-opted into a political issue, which is a tragedy because it's not a political issue, it's a scientific issue, it's an environmental issue. And so it's useful to know what people around us think about it. Any of you who were at the first session, I did talk about this a little bit, this particular slide. This shows a map of Maryland and surrounding areas produced by the Yale Climate Opinion Maps. And this is data from 2020, but the Yale Climate Opinion people have been asking Americans across the nation since 2009 what they think about climate change. And they started calling it global warming. So they still ask, do you think that global warming is real? And when people in Maryland are asked, do you think global warming is real? This is what we find. Okay, here's the key. The first thing to notice is that although there are differences in the degree of acceptance of the reality of climate change among counties, every single county, more than 50% of people accept that climate change is real. Overall, 72% of Marylanders accept that climate change is real, 76% of people in Howard County, 72% of Americans, but a much smaller fraction think that the scientists agree, which is absolutely untrue. The scientists are in almost complete agreement. Okay, it used to be that just 97% of scientists agreed that climate change is real, but this has now been updated in the last few months to indicate that 99% of all scientists with appropriate training, that means some training in earth science or biology or something, accept that climate change is absolutely a scientific reality, that it has progressed over the past, it's accelerated since about 1970, and it is affecting us right now. So unfortunately, because of the, again, as I said, being co-opted by the politics, people are very confused about the science. And I just want to say, without any, any prevarication here, that the science indicate that this is an absolutely real process, and we know where it's going if we don't do anything about it. So it's time to, for everyone to really realize that and accept it. When the people from the Yale Climate Opinion Survey asked folks nationwide and also in Howard County what they think about risk, okay, that this revealed an important blind spot. And this is not just true for Howard County, but the same pattern is very true across countries and in different states. So when you ask, are you worried about global warming? Okay, majority, 68% say yes. Some say they're not worried. This is in 2020. Do you think global warming will harm plants and animals? Yes. Will global warming harm future generations? Yes. 3/4 of people say yes. Will it harm people in developing countries? Yes. Will it harm people in the US? Yes. Is it already harming people in the US? Yes. Will global warming harm me personally? People don't think that it will. So they, even though they've said everybody else in the world is going to be affected by global warming, I don't think it's going to affect me very much. And you know exactly what that causes. People become very complacent when they don't think there's, that they're going to be on the hot seat, literally. And this has really stalled things. The fact that people do not think First of all, that they don't realize that the scientists all agree, and they don't think that they are going to be harmed personally. We know from experience that, and from various scientific data that's been collected, that people who have experienced one or more weather disasters, like giant hurricanes and floods and droughts and whatnot that have been very common recently, that those folks are more likely to accept that climate change is real. And yet, there it is. So I want to take this a little bit farther. And these are data from the Yale Climate Opinion Project from 2019. And these are some additional things that people in Howard County were asked. First of all, when asked, should schools teach global warming? 81% of Howard County, Maryland says yes. And yet there are just beginning to be a couple of projects to teach students in Howard County schools about climate change. There's really very little coverage of climate change currently in the curriculum. We're working to change that. When asked, should the US fund research into renewable energy sources? Overwhelmingly, yes. Should we provide tax rebates for energy efficient vehicles, solar panels? Yes. Should the federal government regulate CO2 as a pollutant, which of course was that privilege, and that privilege to regulate CO2 as a pollutant was given to the EPA under the Clean Air Act. And now some people are trying to argue that CO2 is not a pollutant. Well, there it is. Should the federal government set strict CO2 limits on existing power plants? Yes. How about requiring fossil fuel companies to pay a carbon tax, which really means for us to pay for the damages that our use of fossil fuels costs? How about require utilities to produce 20% electricity from renewable sources? People say yes. Actually, Maryland has made a better pledge than that. But again, pledges are talk. Pledges are not action. So we need to actually back that up with some action. People in Howard County are against drilling for oil in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. They don't want to expand oil drilling. And this is an interesting question because it's posed as if there's a dichotomy between protecting the environment and economic growth. Actually, one of the most important and interesting developments in climate change in the last 3 or 4 years has been that economists are now really starting to recognize that if we do not act, the economy is going to tank. It's going to have a huge impact on gross domestic product. I personally think that when this knowledge spreads, that in fact, there's not a trade-off between environmental protection and economic growth. That in fact, if we don't protect the environment and halt climate change, we will not have economic growth as we've been enjoying. When that news spreads widely enough, I think we will get some serious action. Okay. The Yale people have collaborated with folks at George Mason in these polls, and they have identified essentially 6 groups of people, 6 different opinions on climate change. And they've done what they call a segmentation analysis, which is ask questions that allows people to be assigned to one of these groups. And in 2020, the groups have remained the same since 2009. The alarmed, these people are really worried about climate change. They have the highest belief. They're the most concerned and the most motivated. The dismissive, they don't really think climate change is happening, so they're not very motivated and they're not concerned. In between these 2 extremes are people who are concerned, but not yet freaked out. People who are cautious, who think there's something going on, but they're not really sure. And over the last few years, things have been moving this way. The disengaged, these are folks who are just too busy and too, really not in a situation where they can even take any action. The doubtful, these folks just don't know really what's going on. The dismissive, only 8% of the US, this is now the US, only 8% of people in our nation really deny that climate change is occurring. And, they've got their own agenda for this. So it's really impossible to convince them otherwise because they're not paying attention to the science. If we look at this over time, 2008, sorry, they started doing these surveys in 2006. So this is 2008 to 2020. And it's been up and down, things have increased. But what you can see is this segment now that is composed of the alarmed was only 17% in 2008, is now 26%. The concerned is down to 29%. A lot of those people have gone up here. Cautious, about the same. Disengaged, about the same. 8% versus 9%. These people, they know what they think and they're not changing their minds. So, but the fact is that if I can do mental math, 55% of the country is either concerned or alarmed, and that's a good thing, because unless you're worried about it, you're not going to do anything. A recent survey that these folks again did, George Mason and Yale, they asked this question: do you think global warming should be a low, medium, high, or very high priority for the president and Congress? And this was from this past September. And they showed the division among the political parties in their beliefs about climate change, their acceptance of climate change, and their understanding about the need for action. So these are people who answered very high or high priority. And you can see, let me see. Oh, this doesn't have the average. Liberal Democrats, 94% say we better get with it. Moderate or conservative Democrats, 80%. Republicans, less than 50%, think that we really need to do anything. And conservative Republicans, 17%, think that we need some action. Unfortunately, when climate change worsens, as it is every year, every single year every decade is hotter than the past decade. And we are not going back to the 1950s. Everyone will suffer, not just, the people who don't believe it or the people who do believe it. Everyone will suffer when this actually comes to pass. Okay, 7 in 10 registered voters want corporations and industry to do more to address global warming. This is all registered voters, and you can see corporations and industry need to step up. And as we go down here, citizens, Republican Party, the Congress, your government officials. Okay, I've made the slides available so you can peruse this as you like, or you can go to the Yale program website and look at this in a little bit more detail. Again, it's kind of interesting when you ask who needs to do something. Me personally, well, I don't need to do something as much as all these other people. That's really not true. We all have to do something. So that now takes me from the sort of discussion of what people in Howard County think to talking about our carbon footprint. And there's been a lot of argument about whether individuals can really make a difference. Of course, we need policy changes. Individuals cannot do everything. However, individuals and residential households are responsible for a large fraction of US carbon emissions. So what we do in our homes is in fact important. And you'll see that it's even more important for us in Howard County. Households directly use about 38% of all US energy, okay? However, because we buy things made by industry and we buy services and goods, that use energy in these sectors, households are responsible for about 70 to 80% of all US carbon emissions. And this is from a paper by two faculty at UC Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, in 2010. And in fact, these two guys were responsible for coming up with the carbon footprint calculator I'm going to show you in just a minute. This slide is just to say, hey, we're contributing to this problem by what we do in our own households. So again, this is from that paper, Jones and Kamen. This is how the sort of average American carbon footprint breaks down. So the carbon footprint is all of the sources of emissions that come from our daily lives and our homes and our daily activities. And what you can see on this axis is metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year, because that includes methane, which is a greenhouse gas that is emitted from producing cattle. It's emitted from natural gas, transport and mining, et cetera. And so they put methane and nitrous oxide, two other greenhouse gases, on the same scale as carbon dioxide. Technical point, but this is essentially the amount of carbon greenhouse gas that's contributing to climate change. So the largest sector on of the average American carbon footprint is transportation, motor vehicle fuel. We drive around in our individual cars a lot, and each of those cars is emitting carbon dioxide out of the tailpipe, because when you burn any fossil fuel, it releases carbon dioxide. Okay. Housing is the next biggest sector. Natural gas and electricity are doing heating and cooling. And then there's various other indirect and direct things. Food, the third largest part of our carbon footprint. Goods, stuff we buy, or entertainment, I guess, falls in here. And services are the two, sort of lowest, but if you put goods and services together, that accounts for quite a bit. So I want to just show you a little bit about, a couple things. First of all, there's a very interesting and important relationship between the amount of carbon emissions from a household and the income of that household. And I'll show you data from Howard County in just a moment. But if we contrast, for example, the carbon footprint for the average household in Potomac, Maryland, they are responsible for emitting 85 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year, whereas the average household in Silver Spring, Maryland, about half of that. Okay, so these guys travel more, they do more air travel, they have larger homes, etc. And this relationship between carbon footprint and income is super important. In Howard County, I had the privilege of working with a group of 10th graders last year in the Howard County Climate Change Institute, which is a new program within the Howard County school system. And we worked on, I was the mentor for Team Energy, and two of these students, Sophia Romero and Priscilla Ye, got interested in the relationship between carbon footprint and income in Howard County. And so they ferreted out the information about that. And you can see a very close linear relationship between the average household carbon footprint, okay, tons of carbon dioxide emitted per year, and income, okay? Larger houses, just essentially living larger, buy more stuff, a larger carbon footprint. So this suggests to me, and the data bear this out, that the largest fraction of carbon emissions are caused by the wealthiest nations and the wealthiest people in the wealthiest nations. And so given that, well, I won't go into more detail. If you're interested in more information about that, I'll refer you to my webinar that I gave this past summer, which is a video of it is on my website. Okay, so let's just talk about what is your household carbon footprint. And I'm going to go onto the internet in just a second to go through how you work this carbon footprint calculator. I think this is a particularly good one, and it was, as I said, devised by the guys who wrote that paper about the average carbon footprint. So here's what it looks like. I'm just going to change my screen share now and go to the internet and hope that this works. Okay. Okay, so now we're on the internet. Here's that site, Cool Climate Calculator. You can just Google Cool Climate Carbon Calculator and you will get to it. And the I need to start this over. Wait a minute. Let me just return it and see if, yeah. Okay. The average for the whole US is 50. I'm sorry, I was playing around with this and darn it. No, I can't just reset it by doing this. See? Okay, anyway, let's put our zip code in here, 21042. That's my zip code, 21042. Okay, that's Ellicott City, Maryland, and it's going to pop up over here. See, I was playing around with this. This should all be 0 now. And the average carbon footprint for people in Howard County, Maryland is 70 tons per year. Okay, so that's somewhere between the 84 tons of Potomac and the 43 tons from Silver Spring. And the way this is set up is you put in your zip code and it'll give you the average for your zip code. Okay, and then you put in your particular instance or information, and it'll tell you how much better or worse you're doing. And I'm sorry, I played with this before I got on, and that's why this is not all at 0, but it's initially set for the average for every entry. So let's say 2.5 people in the household is average. If you have 4 people in your household, you have a higher carbon emissions. Okay, so let's set it back to the average. And you just click on this, and that's the way. What is your gross annual household income? Well, this is interesting because I just looked up the average annual in household income in Howard County, which is $121,000. However, the people in Berkeley thought that it was a lot less, because when we put in 121,000, this goes way up. So I'm not exactly sure whether the calculator is just out of date or what, but the point is, when you do this calculator, it's best to just enter what your actual income is, range. Nobody can see this, so you don't have to worry about your privacy or anything like that. So, so this is basically just the beginning. Let's talk about travel. How do you get around? The average includes 2 cars, and they assume one drives around 20,000 miles, one drives a little bit less. They assume that they get 22 miles per gallon. And what happens if you increase that by just about 10 miles per gallon? Let's go up here. Okay, you can see the carbon footprint decline. What if you only have 1 car? Okay, that really has a big impact on the carbon footprint. So if you can ditch 1 car, that's great. Now you can see the problem with having no mass transit in Howard County. It would be so awesome if we could go to Columbia Mall and hop on the metro, but no, everybody has to drive to DC, drive to Baltimore, drive to Annapolis. As you go down through here, I need to move this over for just a second. As you go down through this calculator, you can indicate how much bus, travel, rail, et cetera, you do. And how many flights per year. Let's go to simple. Just how much public transit do you do? How much air travel do you do per year? And so it's perfectly adequate to just be a sort of ballpark, okay? Because I think it's important to just see in general how this works. What do you do in your house? Okay, how much power do you use in your house? The average in Howard County is about 1,400 kilowatt hours per month. And I'd just like to show you what happens if you sign up for your power use to be covered by wind or solar, or you sign up for community solar. So if 0% is purchased from a clean energy program, and we change that to, down here, to 100%, watch the carbon footprint. Okay, 48. So it went way down, okay, down by almost, down by 9 tons per year. Here's natural gas and other stuff. This is the average square footage, presumably in Howard County. If you have a much bigger house, say 3,500 square feet. Wait a minute, how did that work? I don't know how that reduced the carbon footprint, but let's see, go back to average. Well, inexplicable. Okay, so what is your family eating? Okay, so here's average of all of these different food groups. We already know that meat, particularly meat from ruminants like beef and sheep, has the largest carbon footprint of any food. And again, I gave a whole webinar on that. So if you're interested in that, you can refer to my website. But let's just say the average amount of meat, fish, and eggs people eat is 2.6 daily servings. What if you eat half of that? Okay, just watch this. It goes down a little bit. What if you eat twice that? It goes up. Okay, so you can see that meat is the largest fraction of the carbon footprint of food. Dairy, fruits, and vegetables. You can play with all this on your own. Shopping. how much you spend on each of the following. And this is just goods and services. Again, just ballpark. You know, if you charge everything to your credit card, then it's pretty easy. You can just put in an amount a month here. But let's just say the average, what if people buy twice as much as an average person? Okay, that raises your carbon footprint a lot. And it puts it in this column, 100% worse than the average. What about if you do half as much purchasing? It drops it by a lot. So you can play around with this. You can enter your real numbers and you can say, well, what happens if I change it? But the best part of this carbon footprint calculator is at the very end, they offer you 25 different things you can do. Okay, so from more efficient vehicle, electric vehicle, telecommute to work, ride your bike, pretty hard in Howard County, take public transport, practice eco driving. That means don't do fast starts and stops, reduce your air travel, switch your lighting, turn off your lighting, etc. And they will essentially tell you how much you can reduce your carbon footprint if you do these particular actions. And that's why this carbon calculator is so much better than others, which just say, okay, well, you need 2 Earths to support your energy habit. This one tells you how you can reduce it. And if you want to know the assumptions and you want to change that around, you can just click those little carrots here. Okay, so what does that mean? More efficient vehicle? Well, you can't click them very often. I'm going to trade this in. It has, my current one has 37. I'm going to go to 47. I'm going to drive it this many miles. You can monkey around with this and see what happens. As you can with all of the solutions. So for example, you can go down here to air travel. You can say, I fly about this much. I'm going to reduce, it by that much. And then you can see what happens to your carbon footprint. So I'm just going to go back to my slides now, real quick. Oh, wait a minute. That's not exactly what I wanted to do. Excuse me. All right. So these are my slides. Let me just go quickly through these. I had them on slides because I was not convinced the internet was going to work for me. So I want to show you a table of all of those actions. And I got this again off of that very same carbon calculator. And I just want to show you the bang for the buck, essentially. So here are the actions. These are for transportation and diet. So more efficient vehicle, and that means by like 10 miles per gallon, hybrid vehicle, electric vehicle. Here's how much carbon emissions you save if you do these actions. Here's how much you save per year. And here's the assumed upfront cost after rebates. You can argue with this and monkey around with these calculations in those assumptions, whatever you want. It's interesting when you calculate, these are 2 different zip codes, but you can see this is a wealthier zip code in Maryland, and this is a less wealthy zip code. These folks don't drive as much as these folks, so they don't save as much either. But the most interesting, apart from the vehicles, I think the most interesting actions are those which cost nothing, okay? It does not cost you anything to carpool to work or to reduce air travel or to telecommute to work or to ride your bike. And the point of this, a goal that you could strive for, would be to figure out about how much you drive your car every year and then say, could I reduce the vehicle miles traveled, the amount of miles I travel in my vehicle every year? Could I reduce that by 20%? Okay. And if you were able to do that, that's essentially what all of these things are meant to express. You would save a lot of money per year. That's pretty obvious if you don't drive your car as much. And it doesn't cost anything. And to do that, you can combine your errands. That's basically, I guess that's part of eco driving. Excuse me, all of these things together I'm sorry, this is for vehicle miles traveled. This is for maintaining your car and stuff. So all of those things save a little bit. When you add it up, it saves 6 tons, okay, which is more than purchasing a hybrid vehicle. And yet it costs you nothing. It's just changing your driving habits. Now, what about reducing your trash? This is not food waste. This is just regular trash. That'll reduce your footprint a little bit. Eat a low carbon diet. That has a pretty big impact, and it will save you a lot of money because plant-based food is less expensive than meat-based food. And so again, these things all cost you pretty much nothing. Electricity, purchasing green electricity, as Agostino discussed last week or last month, or community solar, both of those save a lot, and they save you a lot of money. I do not recommend anyone install PV solar panels on their roof anymore, because the upfront cost is a lot, and you save a lot, but it takes quite a few years to pay it back. Now there are much better options: either buy that green electricity or sign up for community solar. Again, here's a whole bunch of things that don't cost that much. Switching your light bulbs. It costs nothing to turn off your lights. Reduce that winter temperature. Room temperature used to be 72, now it's 68. And increase your summer temperature, et cetera. So you really have to ask yourself, which of these actions would fit in with my lifestyle? Which of these can I do? And what's the balance between the money you spend and the money you save? So I'm running out of time. I'm going to have to just skip the rest of this. Okay. So great.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I had less time than I thought I was going to have. So I forgot to ask for questions after the Howard County and Maryland opinions, but I would be happy to entertain any questions now.
Yeah, let's ask for all questions.
All questions.
On
Yeah,
any of the topics
whatever
we
you want to
discussed.
ask.
All right, even a new topic if you want to ask a new topic.
If you want to unmute yourself, you can. That would be great. And if you want to just put something in the chat, are there any questions in the chat?
I don't see any questions in the chat.
Okay.
In the meantime, I'm going to take on the screen share.
I was wondering, for the COP meetings, for example, COP26, are all the representatives politicians, or are there scientists who also represent the different nations?
Yeah, that's really interesting. No, there were several thousand people there. And rather shockingly, there were 500 representatives from the fossil fuel industry, which was more than the number of representatives from the various countries. Now, what's wrong with that picture, right?
Yeah, there were a few challenges, right? COVID was one of the challenges. Everybody had to go through a very rigid review of COVID, or vaccination or quarantine. So there were some challenges, and not all the people that normally would participated or could participate. But there are a lot of communities and a lot of activists. It's not just a conference of the politicians. Of course, every country is represented by some politicians, but there are a lot of other initiatives, presentations, discussions. It's a conference of all people interested.
There's a lot of nonprofits that attend, and
Right.
they hold seminars and whatnot. But I just wanted to point out, it's not just the countries. There are a lot of sort of lobbyist types there who are trying to influence the outcome.
And in your experience over time, do you feel like the young people who you work with, the students, are becoming more knowledgeable and more concerned about this issue? I mean, it's anecdotal, it's not broken out in some of the surveys that you showed, but I'm wondering if you're feeling like the young people.
Yeah, I think that the younger folks, I mean, pretty much everybody is younger than me, but if we break it down to students in school, less than college age students are definitely becoming much more worried. People in their 20s and 30s are becoming much more worried. And one thing that was very obvious at COP26 was that there was a lot of student protests and activism. And I felt pretty torn about that, because I think it's really important for everyone to be angry, because this is something that we really should be angry about. This is our planet. We all live on it. And yet most of us regular people have very small ability to do anything about it. from my point of view, as someone who's much older than the students who are protesting, I understand that the incremental progress is valuable, and we have had incremental progress. It is frustrating to me that the incremental progress has been slower than we need. I think the students in high school and college feel like we need everything right now or it's a total failure. And I don't think that's true, because it isn't that black and white. We are on a better trajectory than we were 10 years ago. We're just not on a good enough trajectory to avoid a lot of pain and suffering. Agostino and I were talking before the session tonight about, well, how much difference is there really between reaching a 1.5 degrees centigrade in 2100 and 2 degrees centigrade? Well, there have been several scientific papers about this, and the difference is huge. I mean, it is like trillions of dollars more expensive if we allow the temperature to rise 2 degrees centigrade than if we can hold it at 1.5, because of the increase in disasters and the amount of disaster relief we have to pay for. But also, it's very much more expensive in terms of human life. Millions of people will die millions more people will die if we can't keep it at 1.5 and we get it to 2. If we can't keep it at 2 and it goes to 2.5, then that's more trillions of dollars spent on disasters and more millions of people who die. So this is, I mean, people have already died from climate change in natural disasters that have been exacerbated by climate change. And this is just going to be an increasing process of sort of tragedy, human tragedy and suffering. And so it is important. It doesn't seem like 0.5 degree centigrade makes a lot of difference, but it makes a big difference. So we have to do everything we can think of, everything. Individuals, we have to advocate for policy. We have to push our elected leaders. We have to push corporations. It's important to make sure that we make better progress, because the longer we've already waited way too long. If we'd started in the 1980s, we would have been there now. Okay, 1980s when we recognized that this was a big problem. We didn't. The longer we wait, the more painful it is. And I'm not meaning to depress you, because there is still time to turn it around, but to change everything, we need everyone. And that's, as they say.
Well, we have a question from one of our attendees.
Oh,
If you could
good.
talk about what is community solar, because that sounds like something we could do. That's
Agostino, you talked about that last week.
We presented community solar last month, and I showed how you can join one of these projects. So
I'd like to say something.
Go ahead.
My name is Simon Friedrich.
Hi, Simon.
And
How are
I've
you?
been concerned about emissions since the 1980s, very much so. But all this talk about going to net zero doesn't make sense. How can you achieve that, considering that the more people gain in per capita income, they're going to emit more emissions? People can talk about reducing net zero in 30 years, but reality is you can't do it without going nuclear, and people are opposed to nuclear energy. So effectively, you're going to use land that could be growing trees for solar panels. You're not going to achieve it for the 9 billion people who are going to be here by the middle of this century. It's sort of an attempt to do things that are impossible. That's my view.
Yeah.
You can't put solar panels on land that is dedicated to biosynthesis. You need to use it for photosynthesis, period. And you can't just dedicate land to photosynthesis, to non-photosynthesis applications.
Yeah, I understand. May I take this? I understand your concern, and the whole idea of net zero, I find personally somewhat problematic. The idea of getting carbon emissions to zero requires that we drastically reduce our emissions, and that is the most important thing to do, not trying to sort of cover those emissions by growing more trees or putting more carbon in the soil or something. So that the net zero idea is, well, we want to reduce emissions as much as we can, and then those emissions we can't reduce we'll cover with growing trees or whatnot.
Right.
And the point is that will be, as you say, very difficult, because we need all the land we can have to grow food. But I would like to point out that there have been a lot of really smart people working on this problem. And I think that you could be maybe feel a little happier that it's not impossible. We know that there are multiple ways that we can reduce emissions and get very close to zero emissions without sort of wrecking everyone's lifestyle. And it requires a lot of effort, and it does require the ability to understand that we cannot continue to be so profligate with our use of energy. We may need to change our diets, but that doesn't mean everyone won't have a healthy diet. We may need to become more energy efficient and use less energy. It's a lot easier to cover half of the current energy with clean energy than it is to cover all of the current energy. So if we can make things more efficient, we'll be okay.
There's no such thing as clean energy, first of all. There's no such thing.
If you'd like to, Mr. Friedrich, if you'd like to discuss this offline with me, I'd be more than happy to discuss it.
Every type of energy has its problems.
There is absolutely no free lunch. You are correct on that. But I would encourage you not to give up, because it is, some things are dirtier than others. And I think that probably most people can acknowledge that wind power is cleaner than burning coal when it comes to carbon emissions. If you'd like to discuss this more offline, I'd be more than happy to have an email conversation with you, or even a phone conversation with you. But maybe there are other people who have some questions now and would like to address us to address them. Would that be all right with you, Mr. Friedrich?
No,
I'm going to put your email in the chat. Dr. Vi, I'm going to put the email in your chat for anyone who would like to contact you. And
Happy to talk to you.
And we are running short on time, and I do not see any other questions in the chat. So, I don't want to cut into your
and this is
time
what
any
we're
further.
discussing in our conversations here, is about the actions that we can take, and there's a lot we can do, and there's a lot of technology that can help. So it's about doing what we can do right now. If we feel that there is an urgent need, and the urgency and the consequence of non-action is so dramatic, we can do what we can do with the available technology, and it will be better, right, than what we and there are examples of net zero, as Dr. Vaya explained. It's not about eliminating all energy. In fact, I was reading an article about there are countries that are negative in their emissions because they don't consume as much as the number of forests and things that they have. So it's not impossible.
I'd like to point out, if you're interested in the whole concept of net zero, I gave a whole webinar on that also this past summer. And so you can see the recording of that if you go to my website, and you can dive into that a little bit more. So again, I'd be happy to talk to any of you during the next week or so if you have any questions. Let's just adjourn now, because I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I'll just point out that next month on Tuesday the 14th, Agostino is going to talk about climate change and environmental justice. So shall we end here?
Yes, look forward to seeing you all then. I put the links for the future meeting in the chat, and just thank you again, Agostino and Dr. Vaya. I really, really appreciate it. And, you know, please do give us your feedback in the survey. And I will also share all of the links we shared in the chat today in a follow-up email to all of you. And when this is posted online, I will also share that with you. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to end the meeting right now. And
Okay, bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you all. Thank you. Come back next month.